Hi, I'm Tammy Jacobowitz. I'm a graduate of the Drescher Scholar Circle and faculty on the high school program. As the book of Shemot begins, we encounter two competing narratives, the narrative of Paro and the narrative of God. Each narrative has a unique destiny in mind for the Jewish people. For Paro, the narrative is one of destruction, suppression, limiting population growth for the Jewish people, creating conditions whereby Jews would not be able to create more children, build families. The narrative of God, by contrast, is one of population growth, fulfillment of the promise to the Avot, continued development as a people towards redemption. And in the first two chapters of Shemot, we find that the women, largely anonymous, unnamed, seem to align themselves with the narrative of God. For example, in the first few psukim, we find out, even before we find out about the conditions of slavery, that the Jewish people are experiencing unparalleled population growth. And the words that are used to describe this, the birthing, in verse 7, Uvenei Yisrael paru vayishritzu vayirbu vayatzmu bim'od me'od vatimalei ha'aretz otam. But the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly so that the land was filled with them. If you recall, some of the words in that verse remind us of the words that are used in Breshit to describe the creation of the world. Of course, who's behind these abundant growth? The women. And as the Midrash teaches us, having children, raising children, even becoming pregnant within the conditions of slavery was no easy task. And the women created all kinds of ingenious plans to seduce their husbands, become pregnant, and raise these children. The Lashon that reminds us of Breshit signals to us that these women, who were the agents here of birth, were creating a kind of new creation. The beginning of Shemot aligns us to the beginning of Breshit, and the people behind that connection are the unnamed women. Further along, as we encounter the details of Paro's narrative, we again butt up against women who are willing to voice opposition and bring forward God's narrative. And those women, of course, are the Miyaldot HaIvriyot. Unclear whether they were Jewish women who were midwives or if they were Egyptian women assigned to the task of helping the Jewish women. But either way, and the names that are given, Shifra and Pua, these two women defied Paro against all odds, the threat of death certainly. They lied to his face, and they made sure that these babies would be born alive and not succumb to Paro's desire, which was, of course, to kill the Jewish boys. Finally, in Parak Bet, we encounter another unnamed woman whose name we don't find out until much later, and that, of course, is Yocheved, Moshe's mother. And she, in turn, defies Paro's decree, which was to take the born boys and throw them into the Nile. And she, after she could no longer hide him, famously tucks him away into the Teva, reminds us again of the language of Noach, and puts him into the Nile to safety, hoping for a miracle. So these women, Yocheved, the midwives, and the anonymous women who bring forth the swarms of the Jewish people at the beginning of Shemot, are aligning themselves with God's narrative by being the agents of birth and being able to see that the birthing and the population growth is the necessary prerequisite for the redemptive plan. In Parak Bet, we meet one more woman whose name, again, we're not given until later, and that, of course, is Miriam, Moshe's sister. And Miriam, in this very quick, terse episode, is the one who, in verse 4 in chapter 2, stations herself at a distance, Vatetatzev achoto merachok, lidea ma ye'aselo, to learn what would befall him. After her mother had put Moshe in the basket, she waited, she watched to see what would happen. A whole verse devoted simply to the act of watching and observing. Later on, we see that she thinks quickly on her feet. She runs to see Bat Paro when she takes Moshe out of the water. She offers a very helpful suggestion to bring Moshe to his mother, who Bat Paro doesn't know. She reunites mother and child, but of course at great risk to herself, to her mother, and to her family. In a very famous midrash, which appears in many different versions, these different elements of Miriam's leadership, observing, using language, thinking quickly on her feet, are illuminated to give us ever more insight into how Miriam was positioned as an agent of redemption. Just to paraphrase, the midrash that appears in Shemot Rabbah argues that when Amram, Miriam and Moshe's father, had heard of Paro's decree and said, Kol hayiben hayilod, right, should be thrown into the Nile, every Jewish boy should be killed, Amram said, we should all separate from our wives. He separates from Yocheved, and in turn everybody else follows suit. His daughter stands watching, observing, seeing what her father has done, says, Gezeracha kasha mishel Paro. Your decree is even more harsh than Paro's. Paro had only decreed on the Zecharim, on the male children, but you are not even allowing girl children to be born. Amram hears Miriam's bold efforts to stop his plan. Amram listens and he reunites with his wife, and of course, who is born? Moshe. We see here again Miriam's effort, her leadership is through the medium of birth, of bringing forward Moshe, who will become Moshe Yisrael. We have a lot to learn from these women, to stand in the face of difficulty and oppression, and to voice, even in normal, mundane acts, the plan of God, and to be the agents of his plan. Shabbat Shalom.